is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his teaching the islands will put their hope. This is what God the Lord says, the creator of the heavens, who stretches them out, who spreads out the earth with all that springs from it, who gives breath to its people and life to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeons those who sit in darkness.
The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard, and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant.
Elaine. Yes, and my wife's from Canada too. Actually, I was born in the south, in the city of Chennai, raised in the north, in the city of Delhi. My father was from Kerala, further south. At the age of 20, moved to Canada, and then met Margie there. We were married, celebrate 42 years of marriage this year, and now live in Atlanta, Georgia. So it's funny, no matter where I go, they either claim responsibility or take blame for my existence. If I'm in Kerala, they say he's a Keralite, Chennai, from Chennai. Fortunately, I speak 2 or 3 of those languages and do get by a little bit. But I want you to know what an honor it is for me to be here at Keswick. I was telling Jonathan this morning at breakfast that when I was a young lad and I was a newcomer to Christ, I used to hear so much about the world's great conferences. And of course, Keswick is indeed one of them. Little dreaming that one day I'd have the privilege of standing here and ministering to you. Thank you for doing a great job of singing and ministering to my own heart. It's truly not a privilege we take for granted. So being here and ministering for these 3 days is something I'm very grateful to God for. I want to read for you a bit of a lighthearted story, and I have a reason for that. And then we will move into the scripture reading in the book of Habakkuk. It'll give you a few moments to find it because it's not exactly easy to find, especially if I tell you that it's really sandwiched between Nahum and Zephaniah. But it is there in the Old Testament, a very powerful book. But the passage I want to read for you will bring you a bit of a chuckle and hopefully will make a point as well. It's with the light shining and the brightness here, it's a bit hard to look at the notes, but we'll do it. Here it is. It's a story about a preacher who was interviewing at a new church, and when the interviewing committee asked him what his favorite parable was, he said the parable of the Good Samaritan. They asked him to recite it to them, and he did so in this manner. Once there was this man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among the thorns. and the thorns spring up and choked him. And as he went, he didn't have any money, and he met the Queen of Sheba. And she gave him 1,000 talents of gold and 100 changes of raiment. He got into a chariot and drove furiously. And when he was driving under a big juniper tree, his hair caught on a limb of that tree. And he hung there many days, and the ravens brought him food to eat and water to drink. And he ate 5,000 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. One night when he was hanging there asleep, his wife Delilah came along and cut off his hair. And he dropped and fell on stony ground. But he got up and went on, and it began to rain, and it rained 40 days and 40 nights, and he hid himself in a cave. He lived on locust and wild honey. Then he went on till he met a servant who said, "Come take supper at my house." And he made an excuse and said, "No, I won't. I've married a wife and I can't go." And the servant went out in the highways and the hedges and compelled him to come in. After supper, he went on and came on down to Jericho. And when he got there, he looked up and saw that old Queen Jezebel sitting down way up high in a window. And she laughed at him, and he said, "Throw her down." And they picked her up and he said, "Throw her down again." And they threw her down 70 times 7. And of the fragments that remained, they picked up 12 baskets full, besides women and children. And they said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," Piece. Now, whose wife do you think she will be on that judgment day? Brilliant, brilliant concoction, but it's really not the story. Great genius. You see, a text without a context can easily become a pretext. And you can muddle your way through questions in philosophy or biblical thought and end up with very, very confusing answers. I've often thought of the skeptics of our time. Have they really given close attention to what scrutiny thinkers across history have given to the very questions that they think are now suddenly brand new, that they weren't thought of before? The questions of origin, the question of meaning, the question of morality, the question of destiny, that thinkers have come on the scene and just with some sense of credulity trusted whatever it is they read, even if it was not believable. Solomon raised many a question, and the irony of Solomon is that he had everything going for him: pleasure, literary skill, fame, power, wealth, thousands fed at his table every day. And yet he raised the question of meaning and said at the end of it all, it would be a chasing after the wind under the sun, meaning if you lock God out. Habakkuk was a man who raised the question of where is God in the midst of all the strife and all of the evil and all of the suffering. He was living at the time where the Assyrians were plundering, beheading, destroying. It was at a time when the Assyrian army would come into a nation, behead its intelligentsia, and then put a pyramid of skulls at the entrance of the door or the gate to the city so that people will know they have left their mark there as well. And so prophets saw such horrendous things and rightly asked the question, where are you, God? Are you in control? Are you really sovereign over these situations? I couldn't help but think as Jonathan was praying, the nations he listed, all very real for struggle in our time, and many more other than the ones that he listed. And so here is Habakkuk. The Bible puts it this way: the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, O Lord, must I call for help? But you do not listen. Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save. Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. The famed expositor Martin Lloyd-Jones has a powerful book on this book called from fear to faith. Jonathan himself has written one entitled From Why to Worship that I just saw for the first time earlier on this evening. But here's a man who's asking the question of where God is and why it is that he seems so distant at a time when answers were needed. He raises three issues. Now, obviously, in the time that is on hand, I cannot go through everything here in depth. I will just skim the surface, but I trust at least point in the direction of an answer, that this is much more than just some kind of blind trust. There is an understanding that goes beyond the surface in the lives of men like Habakkuk and women like Esther, who struggled through their very historic moments and asked similar questions and came to the moment for times such as those. He raises three issues that, if anything, are even more complex in our time. Because while violence has always been around from the first family, as a brother killed his brother because of jealousy and not feeling the same sense of acceptance before God. Blood has been shed from the earliest days, but now, because of the capacity to communicate visually and in sound bites, where contexts are sort of not understood quite often, and the dissemination power has grown, we see the possibility of not just violence in a relative sense, but in an absolute sense, where it seems to become the answer for demagogues or for some groups of people. Violence. How long, O Lord, must I cry out to you, violence, and you do not save? When you look at the history of Europe alone, and you all well know the struggles that this great continent has faced and your own land has faced in the previous century. I think Jonathan was telling me at breakfast this morning that the 140-year history of this tremendous conference may have just had 1 year where the conference was not held, and it was during the Second World War. But here it is, the statistics for the last 4 centuries just briefly put in Europe alone. 17th century, 3.3 million killed in warfare. 18th century, 5.2 million. 19th century, 5.5 million. In the 20th century, the statistics up to 1970 were reading 28 million. And in that 20th century, we were not even counting of the carnage in China and in Russia, where 50, 60 million apiece were obliterated for that cause and those ideologies. Think about that. The tens of millions that have been slaughtered in the cause of some kind of venture. And if Habakkuk cried out in his day, watching what was happening, how long must I cry out to you, violence? In the message that I had taped earlier on today, I was mentioning the tragedy of what took place in Brazil last year. I was in Rio de Janeiro for the World Cup of football and reading the articles for protection and safety and so on. One of the stories that was brought up was how last year in 2013, a referee at the end of a game got into an argument with a player, stabbed the player, and as far as I remember, I think the player was killed as a result. The crowd just stormed the field, decapitated him. He was drawn and quartered in the eyes of vast numbers just watching this happen. And you read something like that and say, what on earth? What on earth goes on in the mind of somebody for any reason, leave alone for a sporting event? You know, that this sort of thing was done. Violence, unbridled violence. And Habakkuk raises the question and says to him, how long must I call for you, but you do not seem to say? And of course, living in the United States, where we so often see massive obliteration taking place, if a youngster gets hold of a weapon and marches into a school, you just say to yourself, what story will be the next one? I was in Connecticut some time ago, where that carnage had taken place last year, and a year in December they were thinking back about it. I'm trying to remember, what was it, about 26 people, most of them first graders. And as I drove into town and saw 26 stars on top of the fire station, and they asked me to speak there, and your own Clive Calver from these parts is now the pastor in that church in Newtown. And he was telling me of how they have simply not recovered from that day. There were people in the audience still wiping their tears at even the hint of that story. I cannot imagine what parents must live through when they think of all that went on. Violence. But not only does Habakkuk cry out for violence, he cries out and asks for the question of injustice. He says, why do you make me look at injustice? I think it was a philosopher of jurisprudence and ethics who wrote these words. He said, ours is a day when ethics has become obsolete. It is superseded by science, deleted by psychology, dismissed as emotive by philosophy. It is drowned in compassion, evaporates into aesthetics, and retreats before relativism. The usual moral distinctions between good and bad are simply drowned in a maudlin emotion in which we feel more sympathy for the murderer than the murdered, for the adulterer than for the betrayed, and in which we have actually begun to believe that the real guilty party, the one who somehow caused it all, is the victim and not the perpetrator of the crime. The big three, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, talked about justice as being that supreme ethic, the virtue. And it was Aristotle in his Ethics who says this: justice alone of the virtues is thought to be for another's good, because it is related to our neighbor, for it does what is advantageous to another, either a ruler or a co-partner. Now, the worst man is he who exercises his wickedness both towards himself and towards his friend. And the best is not he who exercises his virtue towards himself, but he who exercises it towards another. For this is a difficult task. Justice in this sense, then, is not part of virtue, but virtue entire. Nor is the contrary, injustice, a part of vice, but vice entire. That, of course, was the Greek thought. And the fact of the matter is, we see justice as a very expendable idea in our time. I think it was Socrates who said, justice is the firmest pillar of good government. And if justice is gone, what happens to good government? I have flown Malaysian Airlines 17 on more than one occasion, taking it off from Amsterdam, heading on to Kuala Lumpur. And you think of the tragedy of what happened. Will there be any justice here? Does anyone hope for justice? For the families, for the friends who pick up the debris and find out that there are going to be very few answers and very little accountability. Violence, injustice, and finally, he raises the question of evil. In his question, he says, destruction and violence are before me, the law is paralyzed, the wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. But he goes from these 3 points here: violence, injustice, and evil. This has become now the cornerstone of our confusion as evil is trivialized. I think Hannah Arendt raising the question when Adolf Eichmann went to the gallows, how he stood erect, head up, chest out, didn't even want his head covered, and made some kind of a nonsensical speech that nothing would turn him away from all the choices that he made, that what he did was justifiable in his eyes. And Hannah Arendt, of all people, commented that as he walked towards the gallows making that speech, she said it was the ultimate trivializing of evil, the banality, the rendering ordinary, totally non-defined concept of evil. Yet, if you were to ask the skeptic, what is it that he or she has against God? 9 times out of 10, the question that will be raised is the question of evil. And that's the way it goes. The category is ill-defined, but clearly clasped when we are questioning the existence of God. And so, here comes Habakkuk, and he starts looking for answers. And the first answer comes to him in Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 18 and following. Of what value is an idol since a man has carved it, or an image that teaches lies, for he who makes it trusts in his own creation? He makes idols that cannot speak. Woe to him who says to wood, come to life, or to lifeless stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? It is covered with gold and silver. There is no breath in it, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. The existence of God in distinction to atheism. Now, why is this so important? Because if there is no God, no first cause, no designer, no ultimate judge, no grand sovereign over the universe, then the question of evil sort of gets buried in the dust and the rubble of history. If you go to Auschwitz, just before you enter the gas ovens, you'll see the words of Hitler, which says, I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel. No God. He became his own deity. Now, I want to point out to you 2 things here, because the question of is it believable arises. God in terms of the first cause, and God in terms of responding to evil. In terms of first cause, the writers like Richard Dawkins and Dennett and the late Hitchens, Sam Harris from the United States, sort of the big 4, the horsemen of anti-theism today with their stridency, talk about this whole issue of origin, that naturalism has explained it all, that theistic frameworks are no longer viable, no longer feasible. Let me read for you a couple of comments here. One from Sir Frederick Hoyle and his colleague Chandra Vikramasinghe. Hoyle, formerly, of course, the astronomer at Cambridge, Vikramasinghe from Cardiff, the scientist. And here's what Hoyle and Vikramasinghe say in their book, Evolution from Space. In calculating the odds that all the functional properties necessary for life might form in one place by random events, they came up with the figure of 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power. 10 to the 40,000th power, that randomly all this could come together. So here's the exact quote now. It is an outrageously small probability that could not be faced even if the whole universe consisted of organic soup. And so here's then the following statement. Life could not have originated here on earth, nor does it look as though biological evolution can be explained from within an earthbound theory of life. Genes from outside the earth are needed to drive the evolutionary process. This much can be consolidated by strictly scientific means, by experiment, observation, and calculation. Now, isn't that fascinating? In an earthbound theory, you can't explain it. So what did Vikramasinghe arrive at? He arrived at the panspermian theory, which Hoyle was first a bit uncomfortable with, then said it's a distinct possibility. And of late, even Dawkins says, yeah, it could be possible that spores from another planet were brought to seed the earth. And that's how it got going. Sir Francis Crick, who got the Nobel laureate for cracking the code of the DNA, he believes a spaceship from another planet brought the spores to seed the earth, and that's how it got going. Please don't ask who made the spaceship. And we're supposed to be the ones who are living by faith. You see, origin is still not a closed case the way they say. My professor of quantum theory in my days at Cambridge, Sir John Polkinghorne, the quantum physicist, in his book One World, and in his lectures, I remember him telling us this: the early contingencies had to be so exact And the margin of error so small, he went through the lineup of them and then came up with just one of those. The expansion and contraction ratios had to be so precise, margin of error so small, that he said it would be like taking aim at a 1 square inch object at the other end of the known universe, 20 billion light years away, and hitting it bullseye. And then in typical English understatement says, there's no free lunch. Somebody has to pay. The creation model is given a challenge, but one would think that they've got an open and shut case with naturalism. No, earthbound theories cannot explain it, said Wickrasinger and Hoyle. And here is all the facts and statistics, but there's something deeper than that I want to go to. What about evil then? What about evil? What does an atheist do with that? I remember years ago speaking in Nottingham when I was first starting out, and a guy stood up from his chair and just shouted at me. He said, too much of evil, no God. Too much of evil, no God. So I said to him, let's remain standing. Let's interact for a moment. When you say there's evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? He said, yes. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law by which to differentiate between good and evil? He hooed and hawed and struggled a bit and said, all right, I'll grant you that. I say, when you say there's such a thing as evil, you assume there's such a thing as good. When you say there's such a thing as good, you assume there's such a thing as moral law to differentiate between good and evil. But if you assume there's such a thing as a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver. But that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove. If there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question? He paused, and I'm quoting him. He looked at me and said, what then am I asking you? Now, one of you may take issue with that last leap, moral law to moral lawgiver. Why do we need a moral lawgiver? The naturalist asks, and here's my response to you. You see, because the question of evil is always raised either by a person or about a person. Which means the question assumes intrinsic worth for personhood. It is either raised by a person or about a person, which means it assumes intrinsic worth for personhood. That is a luxury the naturalist cannot afford. By positing intrinsic worth, naturalism sort of is dismantled in the process. You can only come up with existential definitions, not essential definitions. But the moral lawgiver, God of essential worth, has created you and me and given to us the intrinsic value of human life. All life is valuable. It's valuable, especially at the level of what we would call human life. And so I say, the answer of Habakkuk is fascinating. God is the actuality of God in distinction to atheism. Secondly, the eventuality of his working in distinction to deism. God has set an appointed time. And we see that here in chapter 2. Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, he's puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous will live by his faith. That word should technically be translated by his faithfulness. The righteous shall live by his faithfulness. So the actuality of God in distinction to atheism, the eventuality of his working in distinction to deism. The story was told in Reader's Digest some years ago of a man by the name of Marcel Sternberger who got into a train, the Brooklyn subway, and the article is called "It Happened on the Brooklyn Subway." He gets into the train. It's middle of the day. He'd never got in at that time. He'd gone to visit a sick friend, went to work late, got into that train. And as he got in the train, it was crowded. But just as he stepped in, one man realized it was his station, leaped out of the seat. Sternberger just made a beeline for it, sat down. But he was crushed because the man next to him decided to read his newspaper. He was reading a newspaper, and Sternberger noticed it's a Hungarian newspaper. And he says to him, "You're looking at the classified ads. Are you looking for a job? And he said, no, I'm not. He said, are you Hungarian? He said, yes. He said, if you're not looking for a job, what are you looking for? He said, for my wife. He said, oh, you're one of those who sort of goes to the newspapers? He said, no, sir. He said, this is my story. He said, during the war, I was taken away to Russia to bury the German dead there. And as I was gone, the Allies arrived in my nation, freed the country, and we were liberated. But my wife is missing. I don't know if she had already gone to Auschwitz or somehow she was freed. And I'm coming to America hoping somehow I can find her here. And Sternberger started to think, and he thought, my goodness, a few weeks ago, he's thinking to himself, I was at a dinner where I sat next to a woman by the name of Maria Paskin, who said she was from Debrecen, Hungary. Her husband had been taken by the Russians, and she was rescued by the Allies and brought in here. And he said, I wonder if there's some connection here. So he looks at the man and he says, what is your wife's name? He says, Maria Paskin. He said, and your name? He said, Bella Paskin. He says, get off in the next station with me. And he gets off, and the man Sternberger goes to a telephone booth, and he starts to ring, and it rang, and then this voice picks it up, and Sternberger says, Maria, is that you? And she said, yes. He said, what was your husband's name? She says, Bella Paskin. He says, Maria, you're about to get the greatest surprise of your life. She takes the phone and gives it to Bella Paskin. He picks it up, and he says, hello. And that's about all he could say when he realized he was talking to his wife. And he sobbed, and Sternberger gets him out of the phone booth, gives him some money, puts him into a taxi. And Reader's Digest ends this article in these words. Skeptical persons would no doubt attribute the events of that memorable afternoon to mere chance. Was it chance that made Sternberger suddenly decide to visit his sick friend and hence take a subway line he'd never been on before? Was it chance that caused the man sitting by the door of the car to rush out just as Sternberger came in? Was it chance that caused Bella Paskin to be sitting beside Sternberger reading a Hungarian newspaper? Was it chance, or did God ride the Brooklyn subway that afternoon? I'm standing before you today at the age of 68. When I was 17, you would never have seen the possibility of any future for my life. I had tried to commit suicide out of a complete loss of meaning. My dad had looked me in the eye one day and said, you're going to be a total embarrassment to the family. And the way I was headed, he was right. He said, you're going to bring such shame to us. He did what he thought was right. I took the soundest thrashings of the 5 of us kids. At times I thought my bones would break. My brothers and sisters till this very day say, I can never figure it out, can't figure it out. My dad went after you the way he did. Thankfully, the story didn't end that way, so I'm free to tell it. But you know, a man walked into that hospital room with a little red New Testament, a Gideon's Bible. Just before I came here, I was in Philadelphia speaking at the International Convention of the Gideons, 3,000 of them. And they know my story and what happened. And lying in that hospital room, never having opened a Bible in my life before and unable to open this one because my body was dehydrated with the poison. It was open to me, and it's a long story, I won't go into it. But seeing the words, Jesus said, because I live, you also shall live. Ladies and gentlemen, God intervened in my life at the time I needed him most desperately, or it would have all been over. He has done the same in history. At the appointed time, he sent his son. These punctuated interventions that come and the steady intervention in your life and mine, the revelation awaits an appointed time. We see through the keyhole of our time clicker. God in his sovereignty looks at the panorama from eternity. Time is that brush on the canvas of history. Eternity is the keyhole through which it's all interpreted. We've watched this calibrated movement of change and change and change, and God's intervention is in distinction to deism. God is in distinction to atheism. God acts in distinction to deism. And lastly, God changes in distinction to pantheism. As he says in his verse, the closing verse there, he says, ending all of this, he reminds us in these words, I heard and my heart pounded, my lips quivered in the sound, and at the sound decay crept into my bones, my legs trembled, yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity coming upon the nation invading us. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me feel my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on to the heights. That transformation of life. We may run and run and run. And if I may just take a minute or two over here, if you don't mind, I want to just quote a piece of poetry to you and bring this to a close. Francis Thompson ran and ran and ran with his drugs. He would lie by the River Thames at night and go through Charing Cross by the day to satisfy his longing for drugs. Reading the Bible, reading the Old Testament, the story of Jacob, he penned these incredible words. He's the one who wrote The Hound of Heaven. He wrote, O world invisible, we view thee. O world intangible, we touch thee. O world unknowable, we know thee. Inapprehensible, we clutch thee. Does a fish soar to find the ocean, an eagle plunge to find the air? Do we ask of the stars in motion if they have rumor of thee there? Not whether wheeling systems darken or our benumbed conceiving soars. The drift of pinions would we hearken, beats on our own clay-shuttered doors. The angels keep their ancient places, touch but a stone and start a wing. 'Tis ye, 'tis your estranged faces that amiss the many splendored thing. But when so sad thou canst not sadder, crying upon thy so sore loss, shall shine the traffic of Jacob's ladder between heaven and Charing Cross. Yea, in the night, my soul, my daughter, cry clutching heaven by the hems. Lo, Christ walking on the water, not of Gennesaret, but Thames. He meets you where you are. The hound of heaven follows and follows and follows and changes your heart till you realize he is sovereign. He is the grand weaver. He brings that design. I think it was W.E. Sangster who tells the story of a preacher from Leeds down in Plymouth trying to phone home at night, and as the call is winding its way through the Midlands, they have operator after operator. He started to mutter the words of a hymn. My knowledge of this life is small. The eye of faith is dim. But 'tis enough that Christ knows all, and I shall be with him. My knowledge of this life is small, the eye of faith is dim, but 'tis enough that Christ knows all, and I shall be with him. Not knowing one of the operators was listening, she said, Sir, would you repeat that for me? And he repeats it. She says, you'll never know how much I needed to hear that today. You'll never know how much I needed to hear that today. My knowledge of this life is small, the eye of faith is dim, but 'tis enough that Christ knows all, and I shall be with him. Evil, injustice, violence, the actuality of God in distinction to atheism, the eventuality of his working in distinction to deism, the eternality of his perspective in distinction to pantheism. The Judeo-Christian worldview is unique and gives you a vantage point not only of the answers, when atheism cannot even justify its questions. May God be with you. May you take these truths. It's just the tip of a teaspoonful, I guess, but may have felt like a drink from a hydrant. God bless you. Thank you.